Hello. Thank you for your interest in Equidox PDF remediation software. My name is Dan Toletta, and I'm a senior sales engineer here with the Equidox team. And the purpose of this video today is to give you an introductory training to the platform, to go over the basics of both PDF accessibility, as well as just day-to-day use of using Equidox and navigating the platform. So with that said, let's get started. The first thing that I always mention with Equidox is that it is a web-based application. So you'll notice that I'm just operating through my browser. Now, it doesn't matter what kind of computer you have or which operating system that you're using, but if you can choose, we would recommend using Google Chrome as the preferred browser. My second choice would be Microsoft Edge. So that will give you the best overall experience because Equidox is hosted on the Google Cloud platform. Now, when you're logging in for the very first time, keep in mind that you will see a blank slate here on your documents list. So these are my documents that I've imported from various demos and trainings that I do in my own little personal account. But when you're accessing Equidox for the first time, don't be alarmed. If you don't see any documents waiting for you, you of course need to import some to work on. So I'm going to go over here to the Import Document tab on the left-hand side, and that will bring me to this view. From here, I can click to open up the folders on my hard drive, or if I have my folders already open, I can also just do a drag and drop of a document or multiple documents into this rectangular area. Once that document has a brief second to upload to the cloud, a blue import button will become available. So when I press the import button, this is going to start an automated process where Equidox is going to evaluate this file. The first thing it's going to look for is to see if there's any existing tag structure in the PDF. Now, in the case of this document, there is no existing tag structure. So if I were to just open this up in Adobe Acrobat, let's say, you can see that there's no accessibility tags whatsoever. And if you were to run an accessibility checker on a document like this, if you've used Acrobat before, you can probably predict what you'll see, but it's a lot of red X's telling you that everything is wrong because, of course, this PDF is completely untagged. Therefore, everything is going to be technically incorrect because a screen reader would really have no idea how to navigate this or how to read it to a blind user. So if we were to go back to Equidox here, what Equidox does during that import is even though there's no existing tags in this PDF, during the import process, Equidox is going to automatically detect the encoded text, the images, the hyperlinks, if there are any, fillable form fields, if there are any. So different elements will be found on import so that the remediator, in theory, has less work to do as you're going through the document page by page. If I go back to the document list over here, the first thing that I'll see is that that document I imported now appears at the top of my recent documents list. The 5 documents that you've interacted with most recently will be available on this top menu up here. And then the rest of your documents, as you import more and more, will start to populate down below. There are some pretty basic searching and filtering features that we won't spend much time talking about, but in general, most people are working on a handful of documents at a time. But if you need to find something that you were working on weeks or months ago, and it might be kind of further down the list, you can always try using these sorting and filtering features to go back and find it. Now, what I'm going to do is click on the thumbnail for this document that we've just imported, and it's going to take me into the document detail page. When I'm in the document detail page, there's a few things I just want to point out. First and foremost, we have 2 thumbnails here for the 2 pages that are contained in this document. So this is a 2-page PDF. We have 2 thumbnails, and you can click on either of those thumbnails to go directly to that page and begin working on it. You also have like a searching feature up here. So this is pretty straightforward, but if you have, let's say, a 200-page document and you want to go to page 195, you don't need to scroll through hundreds of thumbnails to find it. You can just type in the page you'd like to go to, and Equidox will direct you to that specific page. You have buttons up here to export the document back to PDF. Now, we're not quite ready for that yet, but we'll eventually get to that point where we're ready to export. I can share the document. So with Equidox being a web-based application, you can share documents with other users in your account or other groups of users in your account if you have groups created. And that would allow anyone, whether they're a single user or within a group of users, to be able to access this PDF and work on it with you. So because it's web-based, everything in your Equidox account is kind of centralized in this one online hub. And everyone that's in the account can, in theory, be kind of contributing to a remediation process. So for very long documents, complicated documents, documents with a tight deadline, you can collaborate and work together with some of your colleagues to make sure that you are meeting deadlines and getting those more complicated documents remediated in a fraction of the time. I can also delete the document. Now, I just mentioned the delete button because, of course, you can delete things, but a lot of people wonder, is there a maximum number of pages? Is there a maximum number of documents that you can process or store in your Equidox account? There's really nothing like that. You can really use Equidox in an unlimited fashion. You can import and export as many PDFs as you need. And you don't have to delete things, but if you want to get rid of duplicates, or if you want to clean up stuff that's old and kind of out of date, you're more than welcome to delete documents at any time. But again, there's no pressure to, there's no like data limitations that you need to be aware of. Now down below, the another sort of element here that I want to point out is the document properties. The document properties are very simple, but they are often overlooked. They're so simple that most people kind of just forget about them when they're creating PDF documents. The primary document property that I want to mention is called the document title. Now, the document title is often kind of confused with the file name. A lot of people conflate the concept of both file name and document title, but they actually are different. And the document title is really required for PDF accessibility. So what will often happen is when people save a document as a PDF, whether it be from Microsoft Word or PowerPoint or Excel or InDesign, a lot of times they don't realize that they're supposed to go into the document properties and add a document title. The document title is really the first interaction that a screen reader user will have with a PDF, and it's really like the first impression. So the title is supposed to be descriptive of what the document contains, so that user would know, is this a document that I want to open up and interact with, or should I keep searching for something else? Now, what Equidox will do, just because we don't want you to be leaving document titles blank, is it will take the file name and it will plug it into the title field for you. And this is really just an effort to make sure that we're not leaving the title field blank, because like I said, if it's blank, the document is going to fail an accessibility checker. It's not going to be accessible. Really, nothing else matters beyond the title if you don't have one set. So we don't want you exporting PDFs without a title. So we make sure that there's at least something in there. However, if you look at this document title and what Equidox has kind of automatically set for us in this case, this is an example of a very bad document title where we're using the file name. So the file name might have some crazy naming convention where the author uses abbreviations and acronyms and smushes the words together and uses random serial numbers that might make perfect sense to them. But this is not something that is universally understandable. Most people would have no idea what this is in reference to, especially if you're a blind user or using a screen reader, and your screen reader is just reading a bunch of words that are all smushed together. This is going to sound like gibberish coming through a screen reader. So we just want to make sure that we take a brief moment to phonetically spell things out, put spaces between words, making sure that we're leaving a nice, clean document title that really anyone would be able to understand if they were to interact with this document. Beyond the document title, there's a field here for the author. Now, authors are not required for accessibility or compliance purposes, but it is a good term to add to your PDF. If you know who the author is, or if you'd like to put in your organization name or a specific department, perhaps, you might set up your own sort of internal method of giving authors to documents. But authors are good for search engine optimization. Same with the title. So like if you're looking for a document, whether it be through a Google search or you're searching on your intranet or you have like a internal search built into your website, it makes these documents much easier to find in the future because these are good keywords to apply to your document. So anyone searching for something like this document would have a much better chance of finding it if you have a good title and you have an author applied. But like I said, the author is optional. So if you don't know who the author is or you don't want to put an author in for whatever reason, you don't have to. It's not a compliance failure. So we can just leave it blank. That's also okay. The other thing here is the language attribute. Now, in the language attribute, we set the language to English by default. And when we set the language to English, we're just telling the screen reader that this content in this PDF is written in English and it should be read with an English voice. If we have documents with languages that deviate away from English, we can change that language in this drop-down menu to make sure that the screen reader is going to be reading that content with the proper voice and the proper cadence. Now, Equidox is not a translation tool, so we're not here to convert English into Icelandic, let's say. But if you had an Icelandic document, you want to make sure that that content is being read within a screen reader that is designed to read Icelandic words. So it's an important step if you have things that are not written in English, but I imagine that the majority of cases, you're probably not going to have to worry about it, as more times than not, documents that come through Equidox are written in the English language. I'm going to save my properties with the save button because I did change my document title. So if you make updates to any of your properties here, just make sure you hit the save button. Okay, now that we've talked about the properties, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to click on the thumbnail here for page 1. And when I do, it's going to take me into the remediation page. Now, the first thing in the remediation page that you might notice are these yellow rectangles that are covering up the content. These yellow rectangles are what we refer to inside of Equidox as reading zones. And reading zones are really the same thing as tags. These are going to produce the tag structure when we get to the point of exporting the document. So while we're in Equidox, we are going to be using the tools within the Equidox system to make sure that a screen reader user is going to have a good experience when they are reading this page. Now, how do we know what a screen reader user is going to experience? Well, in Equidox, we have this button up here that looks kind of like a computer monitor. If you hover your mouse over it, it says preview this page. If you press this button while you're working on any PDF page, it will open up a separate tab in your browser. And in this browser preview, you get this HTML rendering of the page that you are currently working on. So the reason why this HTML is really useful to us is because this is a simple linear representation of how a screen reader would read this page if you were to just stop working and export the PDF as is. So this is showing us our reading order. If we have heading structure, if we have lists, if we have hyperlinks, if we have tables, if we have footnotes, whatever the elements might be that we are kind of adding and changing here on our PDF page, all of the evidence of that is going to show up in our HTML preview. And we're using this to just validate the accuracy of the work that we're doing to make sure that the screen reader user is going to have an equivalent experience to a sighted user as they are reading this PDF. So again, as we make changes over here, we will see how those changes are impacted on our HTML preview. So that's a very important feature. We're going to use the preview page a lot during the training today. So just get used to like using it as a way of checking your work before you move on to the next page. Now, another feature that I do want to point out, it's a feature that I don't really need to use on this page, but it is an important feature. So I want to point it out like early on in this training. It's this little sensitivity slider right here. This slider is meant to change the way that Equidox is detecting the page. So as you move this around, you will see how Equidox kind of gives you different options as starting points with your reading zones. The further left you drag the slider, the more zoomed in and kind of microscopic the zones get. They're much more granular. But then if you bring it way over to the right, you get more of like a zoomed out view of the data on the page. So really, you're using this slider to kind of determine what is the best possible starting point for you as a remediator when you're working on this page. This is also a great way to override existing tag structure. If your documents were tagged ahead of time, whether it be through an auto tagger, or if the source file generated PDF tags when it was saved as a PDF, many times those existing tags are really not worth using because they're just a mess. They were created in an automated way. They're not accurate. And you might find that just moving the slider to reset things is a faster path to a nice accessible page rather than trying to untangle the mess that the source file is giving you. But that's kind of your decision to make. And again, you're just using this to choose a starting point to give you that path of least resistance. Now, hypothetically, like if you bring your slider way over to the right, just to show you the difference here, if I were to go back to my preview, what we will find is that a lot of those paragraphs are now like consolidated with their individual heading, which is really not what you want. And especially when you get down to the bottom section of the page, it is now just combining multiple paragraphs together. and it would tell the screen reader to just read clear across this 2-column split, which is not at all what you're looking for. Now, at the same time, if you bring it too far to the left, things get too granular, and all of these individual zones are inside of their own, or all of these individual lines of text, rather, are inside of their own zones. And if you go to your preview, what you'll find is that you get a bunch of fragmented sentences kind of acting as their own individual paragraph. That is also not what you're looking for. You want to find kind of that happy medium somewhere in the middle where you have more or less the correct number of zones on the page, and you can make your more precise adjustments from this point forward. Now, once I choose my starting point with the slider, the first thing that I typically adjust on any given PDF page is the heading structure. Now, if you're new to PDF accessibility, heading structure is really, really critical. It's kind of one of the pillars of PDF accessibility, and it is the main mode of transportation and travel and navigation through a document. So it is how a screen reader user can kind of skip over sections of information that they might not be looking for and drill down into the document through the headings, so that if they're looking for one specific section, they don't need to read all of the content in between. They can use the headings to kind of bypass things and find what they're looking for in a shorter amount of time. So it's a very important part of PDF accessibility, and you almost visualize it as like an outline of the document, because the headings are going to kind of behave in the same way that an outline would, where it's just giving them the main topics of these sections of information. And if when they find that heading that they're looking for, they can just read the corresponding paragraph or list or table or whatever the information might be. Now, there are some rules with heading structure that we always need to adhere to. The first rule of heading structure is that all heading structure in a PDF document will start with a heading level 1. Now, that will be this element right here. We have this big, bold text at the top of the first page. This seems like a perfectly natural heading level 1 to me, because it is kind of defining what this document is all about. It also kind of stands out with its font style, where the author has clearly tried to like draw my eye to that, giving it more attention, because this is the main topic of the entire PDF. So right now, inside of Equidox, if you look at the little green flags in these upper left and upper right-hand corners, the little green flags, they all say TX. So TX stands for text, because when we imported the document, we didn't have any existing tag structure to speak of. So when Equidox automatically detects everything on this page for us, it is just kind of seeing things for what it is. And technically everything on this page is text. So it gives us text zones as the starting point, and it's our job as a remediator to make sure that we are adjusting things to be a little bit more nuanced and detail oriented, where we are setting up the heading structure for the screen reader user. So for this zone here, if I want to change it from the default text zone to a heading, there's two ways I can do this. I can hit the drop-down menu, and I can scroll down and I can find heading, and I can change it that way. I find that to be a bit slow. I would rather use the keyboard shortcuts. So the keyboard shortcuts would allow me to just click on a zone, and instead of messing with drop downs and scrolling and that sort of thing, I can just tap 1 on my keyboard. And when I tap 1 on my keyboard, it will instantly change to a heading level 1. And if I were to go back to my preview after doing that, what I'll find is that you get this larger font in your HTML preview to visually confirm that that element has in fact been set as a heading level 1. So you'll see this HTML kind of evolve as we make adjustments to the PDF. If I go back to Equidox now, the next rule of heading structure is that once we've defined a heading level 1 for the PDF, we're going to drop down to the next level. So that will be this element right here. This is going to be a heading level 2, because it's like a main section of this PDF. So we want to identify it within the heading hierarchy. We're dropping down a level to properly nest it inside of the H1. This will become a heading level 2, and I will use my keyboard shortcut. This time, instead of tapping 1, I'm just going to tap 2 on my keyboard, and it instantly becomes a heading level 2. And then once I set my H2 here, I look at the next headings on this page, and I see that all 3 of these headings, they share like that consistent font style and formatting. I can kind of use font style as a clue or some evidence to help me set up my heading structure. when I see these three little sections of information using the exact same font style, it's pretty good. It's a pretty good clue to indicate that all three of these would be set as H3s as little subsections of this heading level 2. So if I were to then click on these, I can just tap 3, 3, and 3. And when I go back to my preview, we will again see the evidence of this where we get the larger font style to visually confirm that all three of those H3s have been set, as well as this H2 up here. Now, the reason why I like to set my heading structure first on any given page is because it really helps me kind of focus on the reading order. And if you look here, this really stands out to me as being an issue, having back-to-back headings of the same level. This is breaking another rule of heading structure. So you can have a heading level 1 followed directly by a heading level 2. That is perfectly logical. But if you have a heading level 3, it doesn't make logical sense for the next element on the page to also be set as a heading level 3. There needs to be some reason why we have defined this as an H3. There should be a paragraph or a list or a link or an image, or even an H4 would be fine. But it doesn't make logical sense for an H3 to be followed by another H3. And this is really just an issue with the reading order of the page. So if I go back to Equidox here, I'll take a look. The little green flags in the upper right-hand corner of the zone, they all have a number associated with them. So this is reading zone number 1, this is 2, this is 3, this is 4. Here we have 5 and 6. That's all perfectly logical, just like a standard top to bottom, left to right reading order. But when I get down here, it's still assuming that this is a one-column page, or it should be read left to right, top to bottom. So therefore, I go from reading zone 7 straight across to reading zone 8, and then I have 9 and 10 to directly follow. Now, this is a very easy fix. I just want to make sure that I am putting these paragraphs directly behind their corresponding heading. So I'm just going to use the drop-down menu to change it from one column to 2 columns, and then I'll press the reorder button. And when I do that, the reading order will instantly fix itself. So now my paragraphs are directly behind the heading level 3 that they belong with. The logic of how this works, just in case you're curious, is let's say hypothetically you have like a line that goes right down the middle of the page, like an invisible line. And then Equidox will apply that left to right reading order to the left-hand side of that line. And then anything that remains over in the right side will be found afterwards. So these zones here, although they're technically like, they're in the right column as well, they're straddling the 2 columns. So when I choose this 2-column reading order, they are still found in the left column, and therefore they are unaffected by the 2-column reading order decision that I've made. So we still have this set as reading zone 2. This one is still reading zone 4. This one is still 6. It's just when you get down here that you have 7 and 8, and then over here we have 9 and 10. Now, this is a pretty basic page for setting the reading order. It's fine to just use 2 columns and hit the reorder button. But there are many examples in the PDF world where you can get your reading order pretty close to what you're looking for using one of these 4 options up here. But there might be some oddities within the layout where you have a zone that's just not really cooperating with the layout of the page, and it's not going to be in the position of the reading order that you really want. So let's take this page number just for example's sake. So this page number down in the bottom right corner, this is currently reading zone number 11. Now let's again pretend hypothetically that we want reading zone number 11 to be the second element read on the page. Well, if I look up here at the top of the page, I have this as a reading zone number 1. I have this as reading zone number 2. Well, if I want my reading zone 11 to become number 2, does that mean I need to change 2 to 3 and 3 to 4 and 4 to 5 and play musical chairs with all of the zones on the page? You can imagine that would get very, very tedious and slow and boring to deal with. So what we can actually do is if we want this to be read second on the page, I can just take zone 11 and I could turn it into zone 1.1. So over here in the order field, I can use the decimal system to squeeze this zone right into the reading order wherever I feel like it belongs. And when you go back to your HTML preview, you will see that now you have that page number being read second on the page, even though it's at the very bottom of the page in the layout. You can still force it into the reading order wherever you feel like it's appropriate for it to be read by the screen reader. Now, keep in mind, this is just a hypothetical scenario. So this is not something that you would necessarily do in the real world for a page number at the bottom of the page, but any sort of zone that might be out of order just based on the layout of the page, you can still make that more manual adjustment where you are squeezing that zone in wherever it needs to be. Okay, I'm going to go back to my normal two-column reading order, and we're going to talk about a couple of other concepts here on this page before we jump to the next page. The next thing that I usually talk about in PDF accessibility is the concept of artifacting content. It is a bit of a misconception where when people are tagging PDF documents, they feel that every piece of content on every single page must be tagged. And that's not exactly true. You can also mark elements as an artifact. And when you mark something as an artifact, you're not visually altering the PDF. You're not removing it from view for like a sighted user, but you are just indicating to the screen reader to ignore that information and just skip over it and start reading the important content. So let's take this header, for example. This header, if we look at it and we just kind of use our common sense, we know that the document is already titled Equidox PDF Training Sample File. We have a heading level 1 that says PDF sample document for Equidox training. Is a header that says sample document created for Equidox training, is that really necessary to read to a screen reader user? It's already been pretty well established as to what this document is. So I feel like this header information is completely redundant. So if I don't want this to be read by a screen reader, because I want to give them a more streamlined experience of reading this document, I can click on the zone and hit this remove zone button, or I can also just hit backspace on my keyboard. The backspace key would be another keyboard shortcut where you can remove a zone, and anything that you remove will be marked as an artifact in the exported PDF. So when I go back to my preview, what I'll find is that I no longer have that header being included as part of my tagged reading order. The screen reader is just going to start with the heading level 1, because as the remediator, I feel like this is kind of a more optimal experience for that screen reader user rather than wasting their time with a completely redundant header that is just a repeat of information that they're going to hear elsewhere. The same can be said about like this page number in the bottom right corner. Now, page numbers in many cases are just redundant information because PDF readers, whether you're reading it on your browser, you're reading it in Adobe Acrobat, or wherever you might be interacting with that PDF, PDFs are already broken down at an individual page level, and it's already known by a PDF reader that this is a 2-page PDF and that you are currently sitting on page 1 of 2. So having this number 1 being read as part of the tagged reading order is not really useful information. It can really only be a source of confusion for a screen reader user, because notice that the last line of this paragraph is actually using a sequence of numbers. So if you're listening to this through a screen reader, it might be very easy to conflate that sequence of numbers there with this page number down here, which is just the number 1. So rather than keeping this around for screen reader users to potentially be confused by, I would also recommend marking it as an artifact. Again, you can hit remove zone or you can hit backspace on your keyboard. But as another little trick with Equidox, just to show you like a different way of handling things, I can put a zone on top of a piece of like an area of the page. It doesn't need to fully engulf everything. It just needs to be like a small zone that kind of intersects with a portion of the page. Now, if I then hit I on my keyboard, I for ignore, or I can change the zone to an ignore zone over here in the drop-down menu if I prefer, what will happen is even though there's a number 1 there with a text zone on top of it, the ignore zone intersecting with it means that when I go to my HTML preview, the number 1 is not going to be included. It's also going to be marked as an artifact. But here's the cool thing about the ignore zone. If I were to save the page and go over to the next page, what I'll find is that even though I haven't been to this page yet, the ignore zone is right there waiting for me. So the ignore zone is there to kind of copy itself across all pages in the document. So when you have redundant elements in the headers and footers and things that are going to repeat many, many times throughout the document that are in like a fixed location, instead of remembering to scroll to the bottom of every page and click on that tiny little page number zone and hit backspace, you're liable to forget to do that half the time. So if you create one ignore zone, it will artifact it for the entire document. So kind of like a set it and forget it. You don't really have to remember to do it every time. So I don't really bother with that on 2-page documents. But when you get into 20, 50, 100-page long documents, you might have repetitive headers and footers and things in the margin of the page that you just want to remove and get them out of the way for the screen reader user. So an ignore zone can kind of be helpful in those types of situations, because you're not going to forget to scroll down here and click on that tiny little zone every time. Just be aware though, like don't make ignore zones that are this large. If you make an ignore zone that's this large, sure, it might be okay on this page, but remember that it's going to duplicate itself to every page. So chances are it's going to be interfering with information on subsequent pages in the document that you're not currently looking at. So just keep your ignore zones very discreet and kind of in the extreme margins of the page. They really don't need to be large. They just need to be large enough to like intersect with that area of the page where that header or footer or repetitive element is going to be located. Okay, so this page here, we're going to go through it again. It's a little bit of a review, but there's a couple of new concepts to include. The first thing I'm going to do is just keeping it consistent with the first page is I'm going to mark this header up here as an artifact by hitting backspace. We remember the font style from the first page where we had that blue background with the white text on top of it. We set that as a heading level 2 on the first page. So I'm going to keep it consistent here on this next page. And again, mark this as a heading level 2 by tapping 2 on my keyboard. A common mistake that I see new remediators making with heading structure is a lot of remediators think that you're supposed to restart your heading structure on every single page. So a remediator might end up setting this as a heading level 1 because it's the first heading on this page. But you must remember that a PDF document, despite the fact that it is broken down into individual pages. So it's not like every page is completely separate from one another. They are all to be kind of strung together as one continuous piece of information. So we keep that heading structure consistent throughout the entire document, because even though there's physical limitations of how much data you can put on a PDF page, all of it gets strung together as one continuous flow. And the heading structure, again, is kind of that main method of traveling through the document. So it's important for that screen reader user to be able to jump around and skip over large sections of documents. They don't want to reset the heading structure on every page. You have to kind of adhere to that same heading hierarchy that you've established. You have to stay consistent throughout the entire document. So this is a heading level 2. And here I see that I have what should be another heading level 2, but you notice that it's inside of the same zone as the paragraph. And this isn't really going to work for us because I really don't want to set the entire page, this entire paragraph and the heading as a heading level 2, but I also don't want to leave it as just one big giant text zone or one big paragraph. The problem here is, and this can happen, is maybe someone has a little oversight in their design. They forgot to put a carriage return between the heading and the paragraph. Well, instead of chasing the author of the document down and making them go back to the source file and edit the document and add in a carriage return, sometimes as a remediator, you just have to roll with the punches and understand that PDFs are rarely perfect, and you have to just deal with what you get and make sure that it's accessible regardless of the little design flaws that might be present in that document. So if I don't have a good detection right out of the gate, I can also just like grab a portion of the zone and just like drag it up. When I drag that zone up, I'm now going to set that as a heading level 2, and I'm going to click and drag to create a new zone for that paragraph. When you create a new zone, it's going to be a text zone by default because that's like the most commonly used zone or tag type in a PDF. So you're going to click and drag, and when you do, it's automatically just going to be text until you change it. Now, if I were to go to the preview after making that adjustment, What will stand out to me is that that paragraph has somehow jumped to the top of the reading order. And the reason why this happened is, remember when we deleted this zone up here, that was reading zone number one. So when I added this new zone, there was already like a gap in the reading order. So this just took over the position of reading zone number one on the page because there was a whole number that was removed. So then this just backfilled it and it became reading zone number one. So when you're going quickly through a PDF and you're making adjustments on the fly and you're in the rhythm of the document, it's still very important to double check that HTML preview to make sure that something like this doesn't slip through the cracks. Because if you're going fast, this would be a very easy thing to miss if you're not checking your preview. And if you don't check your preview and you don't fix this, what you're actually telling the screen reader user is that this paragraph here is attributed to the heading level 3 that was way back on page 1. So that's not really like accurate at all. It can lead to confusion, and it all just came from going too quick and making adjustments to a page without checking your work before you move on. So it's a very simple fix. And you're just going to hit the reorder button and everything will go back to normal, where you get that standard top to bottom, left to right reading order. And now that paragraph is going to directly follow the heading that it belongs with. I can't overstate how important reading order is, and that's really why it's important to use this HTML preview. Reading order, in my opinion, is probably the most important part of PDF accessibility. Even if you put the right type of tags on top of content, if those tags are read out of order, it can completely skew the meaning of everything. You can confuse a screen reader user and sometimes just outright, downright, misinform them because they're not hearing the information in the right order, and they could have a completely incorrect understanding of the content because the things that were read to them were read out of order. So always be double checking your reading order, especially if you're making changes to your zone layout. So if you are deleting zones, if you are adding new zones, if you are moving things around on the page, that can have an impact on the order of these zones. So always use that HTML preview to double check things. If you have a very simple page where it's maybe just a couple of paragraphs and you arrive at that page and you realize that it's already zoned correctly, in many cases like that, you don't really have to look at the preview because it's just, you're not even making an adjustment. You're just kind of clicking through and verifying that the zoning of the page was accurate. But if you do start making changes by deleting things and moving stuff around, it is important to make sure that you are resetting that reading order and confirming with the preview that everything is going to be presented in the order in which the author would have intended for this data to be read. Now, down at the bottom of this page, there's a couple of images. Now, these images are very basic, and I put them in here just to kind of, include some basic information about how to handle images inside of Equidox. Now, in the PDF accessibility world with images, you have two choices. You can mark an image as an artifact, or you can give it a description. Now, if you want to mark an image as an artifact, it's really very straightforward. Let's take this generic like lorem ipsum graphic here. This image really serves no value to this PDF. There's nothing that I would really say about it that would make this document more informative or more interesting to a screen reader user. This is a completely generic, little cartoonish doodle that I grabbed off of Google Docs, and it's really just there to kind of take up space on the page. Now, if I click on it, all I really have to do to artifact it is, again, just hit backspace on my keyboard. And as you can probably predict, you won't see any rendering of it over in your HTML preview. So only the Equidox logo is now showing. And if you are going to keep this Equidox logo as part of your tagged reading order, you want to make sure that you are clicking on it and coming over here into the description field and typing in something like Equidox logo as a description. We don't need to be super wordy and verbose about describing a logo. So that's kind of a mistake that I see people making, where they get way too overcomplicated with their alt descriptions on images that need a very lightweight description. So if you have something like a logo, just call it what it is and move on. Just a couple of words should do for describing a logo. Don't type in that all of the letters are capitalized and it's using dark blue font and the O is light blue and there's a check mark inside of it. You don't need to write in a paragraph to describe a logo. It's just important to make sure that if you're going to keep this logo as part of the tagged reading order, that you give it a brief, little short, concise description so that the screen reader user knows what it is. They don't need to know all of the aesthetics and the design of it. They just need to know that it's a logo, and then they can move on, not wondering, is this a pie chart or is it something critical that's giving them, information that they're missing out on? Okay. And then another question that I am often asked about images is what description and title for. These are for HTML exports only. So if you're not aware, in Equidox, you can export a document to an HTML format or an EPUB format. These two properties here really only relate to those, HTML-based formats. You don't need to worry about them if you plan on exporting your document to PDF. So and most of our users are kind of exclusively exporting documents back to the PDF format. So really, you just need to worry about the description field. This is what's going to populate the alternative text for that image. Anything that you type in here will just kind of be lost on export. So don't even bother like wasting your time. Put your alternative description for an image inside of this top field here. And for the most part, just ignore these two unless you have a reason to convert your document into HTML. Okay, so what I'm going to do now that I'm done with this page, I'm happy with it. I've looked at my HTML preview. It looks pretty good to me. What I'll do is I'll mark the page validated. So when I mark a page validated, this little check mark up here will turn green. It doesn't like do anything to the exported PDF. It doesn't change the tags in any way. But what it will do is it just indicates to myself or to other users that I might be collaborating with that this page is finished and there's really no reason to worry about it. I don't need to go back and keep adjusting it. I know for sure that this page has already been worked on because I've marked it validated. Now, I can also always go back and like retroactively mark a page validated. So we know that we already worked on page one. So I can also just mark that validated too. I can just come back and click on it if I'd like. Now, again, it doesn't change the document in any way, but if you are working on, let's say, a 200-page report, chances are you're not going to just sit at your computer and work on 200 pages, from start to finish without taking a break. You might be picking a document like that apart over the course of a couple of weeks, as you have like little 10-minute windows of time during your day. You log in and you work on a handful of pages. You log out, you come back to it the next day. Maybe someone else logs in and they work on a few pages for you while you're away. You take a vacation. Before you know it, you can't remember which pages you worked on, which pages you skipped, which pages your friend worked on. So without having to guess as to like where did you leave off, which pages do you still need to go back and fix, you can mark pages validated. That way there's no ambiguity to it. You can just, directly go to the pages that you need to. And real quick, before we export the document, I do want to point out a few other things about the interface here. So on the interface, the right-hand side, you have like these thumbnails of the different pages. That is a collapsible menu, so you can get that out of the way if you choose to. So if you want to expand or collapse it, it's pretty straightforward. It's really just a user choice and a decision. The X up here, this will close out of the document and take you back to the document detail page. So we, of course, have already used this before, but just in case you're wondering, this will close out of it. The lowercase I button, this little menu here, will pull up, and it's the shortcut menu. So the shortcut menu will show you all of the keyboard shortcuts that you can use. I have already used a few of them. So like the number on your keyboard to set the heading levels, that's pretty straightforward, pretty obvious. If you want to set a zone as a table or set a zone as a list, the keyboard shortcuts are relatively, straightforward and intuitive, like backspace or the delete key for removing a zone. So you will get the hang of these after a while. You don't have to memorize all of these from start to finish, but the more of this that you start to use, just the faster you'll become as a remediator, because it will minimize the amount of mouse movement and clicking and dragging and scrolling through drop-down menus. So if you can just save yourself a few seconds here and there by using those keyboard shortcuts, by the end of the day, it adds up to quite a bit of time that you're saving. So that menu is right there in case you need to refer to it. There's also like zoom in and zoom out buttons. These are pretty self-explanatory. It's really just a user preference, whatever you'd like to, whatever zoom level you'd like to get to. We talked extensively about the preview button, and we're going to continue to use that as we continue this training. But there is another preview button. Now, this one here, if you hover over it, it says fixed preview. This button for the fixed preview, it's really only related to fillable forms. So I wouldn't even bother looking at it unless you're working on a page that contains fillable fields. So we will save that for another day and another time. But for the most part, I wouldn't really waste my time looking at this preview button unless, of course, you are dealing with a page containing form fields. We've talked about this preview button plenty. We just talked about the validate button, which is now green because we marked this page validated, knowing that we're done with it. There is a save button. Now with Equidox, you're always saving at the page level. So if you're trying to go from one page to the next, Equidox is going to remind you to save your work before you leave the page. Equidox is, of course, browser-based, and everyone has had like a nightmare situation with browsers, right? You have 50 tabs open, you hit the wrong X because the little tabs are like a centimeter wide, and you can't see which one you're closing, or your browser crashes and it needs to update and reinstall itself, or whatever might happen. You never know with browsers. So you're never really at risk of losing any progress with Equidox because you're saving every time you leave the page. But there is, of course, a manual save button, so that if you're halfway through a very complicated page and you just need a coffee break, you can save it and just walk away from your computer, resting assured that no matter what happens, you can always return to that page later and it will all be restored for you. This little circle button here, it says toggle zone info. Now the zone info, that's those little green flags in the upper left and right hand corner of the zones. So you can turn those on and off if you don't want to look at them. Some users don't really appreciate them. They don't really want to look at them. They find them to be a little bit of an eyesore. And again, that's just a user preference, so it's up to you. I don't really mind them when I'm working on most pages. If the page is very crowded with lots of little tiny zones, they can be a little bit annoying to look at, so I might temporarily disable them in that case. But again, it's up to you to kind of toggle that on and off with this little circle button. So the choice is yours. There is an undo and a redo button. So if you have like an undoable action on a page, you can hit that undo button. And the redo button will populate if you've undone something. So if you can go back a step, in case you hit the undo button like 20 times and you meant to hit it 18 times instead, you can always like toggle back and forth. Now, I don't really use those features all that much, but they are certainly nice things to have and not need rather than need and not have. So undos are right here, undo and redo. We talked about reading order and the 4 options that you have. We talked about the slider, and this is over here. These arrows are going to take you from page to page, or you can search for a specific page. Now that I'm done with this page, I'm going to close out of it, and here's Equidox reminding me, hey, don't you want to save your work before you leave? And of course I do. So now that I save, I come back out to the document detail page, and I'm finished with the PDF. So what I'm going to do is to go to the export tab. And when I go to the export tab, it's going to give me some different options. The first and kind of primary option is the PDF. So this is what most of our users are focusing on. If I click on, well, the PDF option is selected for me, but if you want to, you can also change it to HTML or EPUB if you want to convert it into one of these other formats. But I'm going to focus on the PDF format. So if I just hit generate PDF, Equidox is going to produce a brand new document for me. This new document is going to open up in my browser. And when it does, I can see that it really is the same document that I started with. It looks identical. Nothing has changed about it visually. But if I were to download this version of it, and I'll put it over here on my desktop. And when I do, I'll open it up and I will see that instead of having the original, which was completely untagged and it was failing all of these different criteria and the accessibility checker, it had no tags available. Here's the new one that I just created. This one is fully tagged. And if you want to look through the tags, you certainly can. Now, again, this is just a reflection of what we saw in the HTML preview. So if you don't have access to Adobe Acrobat, if you don't know how to use Adobe Acrobat, if you don't really know what you're looking at here in the tag tree or how to interpret this, don't worry, you're not really missing out on much because this is really just a representation of what we saw in the HTML. So first and foremost, like we start with our heading level 1. Then we get into a heading level 2. and then here's a paragraph, and then H3 in a paragraph, H3 paragraph. And take note of the reading order. And then we have another H3 in another paragraph. Also notice that the header and footer are marked as artifacts, so they're not appearing in this tagged reading order. And when I go over here, I start with an H2 and then a paragraph, another H2 and another paragraph. And there is my figure tag, which contains my Equidox logo description. If I were to then run the accessibility checker on this document, Equidox is going to show, or I'm sorry, Acrobat is going to show me that all of those things that were failing before are now passing. So I've cleaned up that accessibility checker report. The only two things that will remain, and if you use Acrobat, then you're very used to seeing this, but if you've never used Acrobat before, these little question marks, these are not issues, these are just reminders. Acrobat will always tell you that you need to manually check your reading order because it has no concept of reading order. As far as Acrobat is concerned, this could be an upside down 3-column flowcharts. It has no concept of what the reading order of any PDF document ought to be. That requires human interpretation. But of course, we have already set the reading order. We've checked it twice over at this point. So we know that that reading order is good to go. Also, color contrast is something that Acrobat does not check for. To be honest, color contrast is another sort of avenue to go down where you have to really think about it when you are designing documents. You don't want to be in positions where you are individually editing PDFs page by page for the fonts and the colors and the size of different elements. That opens up a huge a basket of snakes that you need to untangle. It's a very, very complicated process to try to edit and visually manipulate a PDF. It is really not what the format is for. You should be thinking about color contrast when you are picking out your color palettes and your style guides and setting up templates for your documents. You don't want to have to go back and then edit a bunch of PDFs that came from the same template. You would rather fix your contrast at the template level and then not have to worry about contrast once these documents start getting saved as a PDF. So for the most part, you just ignore these two little question marks because they're always going to be there. They're not issues, they're not failures, they're just reminders to check these things in a more manual way. Now, this again is me just using Adobe Acrobat as a standard comparison because many people are used to looking at PDFs in Adobe Acrobat. This is kind of the default PDF tool, considering Adobe invented the PDF format. Almost everyone uses Adobe Acrobat just as kind of their go-to PDF related tool for all things related to PDFs. Now, if you don't have Acrobat, just keep this in mind that the HTML preview that we use, it basically operates in the same way that an accessibility checker would. You're kind of checking things before you even generate the new PDF here. But let's say hypothetically, you have some mistakes in your remediation process. Like maybe I set bad heading structure. Maybe I start with like an H2 and then at some point I skip over a heading level and I go all the way to an H4. If I do that, maybe I go to page 2 and I have this logo here, but I forget to give it a description. So if I were to like save this version of the PDF and export it, I might have like little oversights in my remediation effort. If I generate this version of the document, it's going to give me the new PDF, but it's going to give me these warnings as well. So these warnings that I get are just reminders that you're missing a description for your image. Your first heading is not an H1, it's an H2, and then you're skipping your heading levels. You're going from H2 to H4. So these types of like warnings here are kind of meant to act as like an augmentation to the HTML preview. In theory, you're catching all of these things at the point of remediating. But if anything slips through the cracks, when we export the PDF, you still have this accessibility checking that's being applied, where it's making sure that it's producing a valid tag tree. So again, if you don't have Adobe Acrobat, if you don't have access to it, or you don't really know how to use Acrobat, you don't really know how to interpret these tags, it's okay. Equidox is still going to run this validation process for you when you generate the PDF. Okay, now that we've finished off this document, The next thing that I want to talk about is some different element types, because not every PDF is heading structure and reading order and some simple images. Sometimes there's other elements to be aware of, primarily lists and tables. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import a different document. I'm going to go back to the import document screen where I was before, and I'm going to grab a different PDF. So if I go into my demo documents here, I'm going to grab another like relatively simple one-page document, but this one will have some different elements in it that we can take a look at. So when I do a drag and drop, it's going to upload the document again, just like we did before, and I'll press the import button. And when I press the import button, it's going to go through that same process of kind of unpacking the PDF and bringing it into the system and doing its standard like zone auto detection, just like we saw with the very first document we worked on. I then can click on the document and go into the document detail page, and then I'll just click on the thumbnail so we can get right to work here on these actual zones. The first thing I'm going to do is move my detection slider over a little bit from the left to the right to make sure that I get a better detection of all of the paragraph granularity on the page. And just before we get started and start making adjustments to the individual zones, I'll take a look at the HTML preview. So in the preview, I can see that things look pretty scary on this page. There's a whole bunch of clutter and stuff going on. And where do I begin? Well, just to stay consistent, let's make sure that we're setting some basic heading structure. So I'll just call this top element here a heading level 1. And then I'll call these sort of section dividers heading level 2. So this is just a one-page document. The heading structure is pretty straightforward. You can't mess it up too bad on a one-page document. But again, just to stay consistent, I'll set an H1 and a couple of H2s. Now, when I go to my preview, what I will find is, again, I have the headings identified and I can see the proof of that. So that's great. But I still have some big problems here that need to be sorted out. The first problem is there is supposed to be a list on this page. And right here is where that list is located. If you can tell, it's not really a list in its current format. It's just kind of like a strange run-on sentence. And all of the list items are kind of blending together with really no punctuation or anything to distinguish how they relate to each other, where the individual list items stop and start. So this is not ideal. We don't want to leave the PDF in this state where we don't really have proper list items created. Now, if I go back to Equidox, I'll see the problem here right away. All of those list items are technically just sitting inside of a text zone. Because to a machine, there's really nothing special about this. This is just a block of text, no different than anything else on the page. And so as a sighted user, we can visually see like a bullet point, and we know to look directly next to that bullet point, and we can see that there's a list item there. We see that there's 5 list items in this list. We know where those list items kind of begin and end. So it's very easy for us to put these little puzzle pieces together using our eyes. But with a screen reader, if it's just being told that this is a block of text, then it's going to read it for exactly that. And therefore, you end up with this sort of strange formatting where it's really just a big run-on sentence, nothing to kind of distinguish the list items from one another. So it's very easy to fix lists inside of Equidox. All we really have to do is tap L on our keyboard. When you tap L on your keyboard, it will change the zone to a list, and it will drop you down to the list detector. When you get down here to the list detector, it is just another little slider. And if you just bump the slider from left to right, it will automatically find the list items for you. So when I go back to my HTML preview, instead of having just a long run-on sentence, I have a list with 5 distinct list items. Now the list slider, I just use the first setting for it because this is just a very standard like bulleted list, as the majority of lists are in the world. But you can have other lists that get a little bit more complicated when you're using like numerical values or Roman numerals to define the list labels, or perhaps you have what are called nested lists when you have lists inside of other list items. We have other settings on the slider that are using artificial intelligence. So it's a combination of computer vision and machine learning. And it's able to pick up on those more complicated list structures. And so if you get into lists that are more complex, or your list is just, beyond like standard bullet points like this, you might try using the other detection levels and then having Equidox automatically detect those list structures for you. So we'll keep the list sort of instructions in this training video pretty straightforward. In the majority of cases, you don't need to overthink it. Just put a zone on top of the entire list, hit L on your keyboard, and bump the slider from left to right. The next element on the page that I really want to focus on is the table. Now, this table, if we go back to our HTML preview, we can see that it is a big problem over here. It's just a bunch of random numbers and values on the page. There is not a human in the world that can tell you with any level of confidence what that 190 means, because there's no real rhyme or reason to how this data is being presented. It's all just kind of scattered and all over the place and very, very random. Now, much like the list, as a sighted user, we are able to look at a word way over here on the very far left edge of the table, and we can see that it lines up over here with like 816, and then we can see that that 816 falls underneath this 2014 with the bold font. So our eyes can very quickly kind of solve that puzzle of row headers and column headers and the grid lines to kind of lay things out for us. So it's easy enough to interpret this type of data. But when you are giving this information to a machine or a screen reader, as far as a screen reader is concerned, as of right now, there's nothing special about this. This is just a bunch of like clusters of text, and therefore you end up with this type of view in your HTML where you get all these random numbers just kind of clustered together. So we just want to ignore all of this right now. We don't want to try to use the text zones to make this accessible. We are going to just simply take a zone and put it right on top of the entire table. So once we put that zone on top of the table, I'm just going to hit T on my keyboard, T for table, and it's going to change the zone to a table for me. And when it does, I can either hit the table editor button, this blue button right here, or I can just double click on the table itself. Either way will work, either the button or you can double click. Now, when I go into the table editor, the first thing that I see are these green grid lines. Now, if you want to, which you don't really have to, you can make adjustments to these grid lines. You can move them up and down. You can add additional columns. You can delete columns. You can add rows. You can delete rows. You can make these types of tweaks and adjustments manually. However, I would prefer to just use the table detector. The table detector are just these sliders where if you just nudge these sliders from left to right, these green grid lines will kind of rearrange themselves to perfectly align with the table. So now you'll notice that like all of the rows and columns are neatly defined for you, and they align with the data cells within the original table. So if you look at the preview for the full table, you will see that it opens up a separate tab in your browser. Now we're just looking at the table, where we actually have something that resembles tabular structure. So it looks much more similar to the table from the original PDF. It's a big improvement compared to whatever this big wall of data and information contains. Now, if we take a look here at the table, there is one thing that we need to make sure that we are adjusting, and that is in the very far left column. If you notice, there's these empty cells. Now, these empty cells are kind of a problem because really these are row headers. And if we don't fill in these empty cells, then all of the data in this row, it doesn't have a row header to associate with. So the problem with this table is it's just the way that it was visually designed. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just that the author has chosen to put faculty as a row header for both rows, but it's only physically located in one of the rows. So this row here, it's just like a naked row header. So we need to make sure that we are combining the two cells here through a process called spanning. Now, spanning is a very simple operation inside of Equidox. All we're going to do is click inside of one cell, hold Shift on our keyboard, and then click inside of another cell. Now, both of those cells are selected, and a span button becomes available. You can also just hit S on your keyboard, and both of those cells will then be consolidated together. So instead of having a single row header in an empty cell, we're going to have a row header that is straddling the two rows. So again, I'm just holding Shift and pressing S on my keyboard. And when I go back to my preview, I will see that my row headers are now straddling the two rows. So faculty will be the row header for both sets of these table data rows. The bold fonts in the tables are an indication of headers, whereas the standard font is an indication of table data. Now, this table here is a pretty standard table in the sense that you have a single level of column headers. So like the year 2018 is acting as a column header for all of the data in that column. And over here, like undergraduate is acting as a row header for all of the data in these two rows. Now, some tables are a little bit different where they don't have a one-to-one ratio of column and row headers. Let's just pretend hypothetically that this is like a financial table and it's fiscal year 2021 as like a column header. But then underneath that fiscal year column header, you have 4 other columns, and it's subdivided by Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. If that's the case, you want to make sure in those situations that you are setting your column header to 2. And then if you go to your preview, you'll find that the top 2 rows will appear with that bold font to indicate that they will both be set as column headers. Now that will make sure that if you do have like a subdivided column header with 4 other sub columns underneath it, that not only will the 2021 be set as a column header, but again, if it's a financial table, like the individual quarter is also set as a column header. So if they're trying to figure out what this 208 is related to, it's not only 2021, it's specifically Q1 of 2021 or Q2 of 2021, whatever column it might fall under. Now, that's not appropriate for this table. For this table here, we're just going to stick with our standard one-to-one ratio. But if you have different tables with different column header and row header ratios, you can adjust it here in these 2 windows for your column and row headers. So I will save the table now. And when I close out of it, it's going to take me back to the PDF. And you'll see here that all of the extra zones that were there before, they have all been replaced by just the one single table zone. And if we go to the preview, everything here looks a little bit more normal. We have a table, we have our list, we have our heading structure, we have a couple of paragraphs. So that looks, much more consistent with the PDF itself. However, down at the bottom, I do have one more issue here. And that is the fact that I have like some sort of bar charts on this page. And this bar chart is, well, it's kind of difficult to analyze because for some reason, there's like 4 images stacked on top of each other. Now, I don't really know how this document was created or why 4 images were layered on top of each other to produce this bar chart. But again, it is what it is. And sometimes as a remediator, you just have to, again, roll with the punches and figure out the best way of making this accessible to someone who's using a screen reader. Now, first things first here, I really don't want to deal with 4 separate images. Like, I don't want to type in 4 alt texts. That would be kind of redundant, and crazy, like 4 separate alt texts for one bar chart. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. So what I might do to get myself started here is if I go over to the page tab. Now, I didn't really talk much about the page tab before, but you won't spend as much time on the page tab as you will on the zones tab. But the page tab allows you to do certain things that apply to the entire page, and you can actually apply your settings to all pages in the document. Sometimes there's documents where this makes perfect sense because it's kind of like very templated and like uniform in terms of like page to page. It's very similar in terms of like the fonts and the formatting and the spacing between your paragraphs and that sort of thing. So if you find like a detection level that works really well, you might choose to apply it to all pages. However, one setting over here that I do find myself using pretty frequently is the images checkbox. So I can, of course, like click on these images one by one and get rid of them that way. But I can also just deselect this images checkbox and they can all be like artifacted at once. So just to save myself a couple of seconds, if I just deselect that images checkbox, you'll notice all of the images disappear. And of course, if you go to your HTML preview, you will see that they are no longer included over here, indicating to you that they've all been marked as an artifact. But when I mark those images as an artifact, what am I really left with? I am left with a bunch of words that are kind of surrounding the bar chart. So these are like the labels on the y-axis. On the x-axis, I have like these different percentage values. Over here, I have kind of like the key, which is indicating which color bar correlates with which year. So all of this information that's being tagged right now just as basic text, what does it really mean to a blind user? It's very, very confusing, right? It's not clear, like, what does very satisfied mean if there's no way of knowing like how far across the x-axis that black bar, that dark gray bar, that light gray bar are traveling. So I want to make sure that I'm kind of cleaning this bar chart up and doing something with all of these labels that are kind of surrounding the bar chart. Now, a little trick for handling a bar chart like this would be, um, I can, of course, click on the individual zones and hit backspace to get rid of them one by one. But another little trick that I can use, and this is not a trick that you will use every day or on every document, but I can put one zone around the whole area of the page, and I can change this zone to what's called a sensitivity zone. Now, a sensitivity zone is not really like a tag type per se, but it is a zone that you can use inside of Equidox. So when I use the sensitivity zone, I can nudge this slider around, and it's the same concept as the slider for the full page. But when I use it inside of the sensitivity zone, it's only affecting the area of the page where I have drawn that sensitivity zone. So if I drag it down to 0, I can make all of those little zones go away with one quick step. And now that I've gotten rid of all of those little zones that were in my way before, I can change the sensitivity zone to a graphic. And when you change it to a graphic, you are now taking what used to be like 4 images and a bunch of crazy text zones. I've now consolidated the whole area of the page into essentially what is one image. And I can give that image a description. So if I were to like look over at my HTML preview of the full page, you'll see that instead of having all of that kind of messy information that was scattered all over the place, now I have one nice, neat visual rendering of that bar chart. And I can give it one consolidated alt description, just the same as if it were an image. Now, we talked about some very simple images on the previous document where we were looking at, a generic graphic and we were looking at a repetitive logo. And for the most part, when you have things like repetitive logos or just decorative information, you can you can mark those types of images as artifacts because they really are just speed bumps for a screen reader user. They slow them down. They just require them to like read alt text that doesn't really add any unique information to the page for them. But when you have something like this bar chart, there is information being shared through this data visualization technique that is important for the screen reader user to understand as well. So in terms of writing alt text for images like this, I do see different mistakes being made where someone might just look at this bar chart and type in an alt description that is very, very high level and too generic, where they just literally call it a bar chart. Well, yes, it is true that this is a bar chart, but you need to be more descriptive than that because there's actual information being presented through this bar chart that you need to specify in the description itself. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, I don't want to write in a 10,000 word essay. I don't want to sit here and type out a description for a half an hour and overwhelm a screen reader user where we're giving them so much information through the description that there was no way that they could possibly follow along and keep track of what I'm writing. So I want to kind of find like a happy medium somewhere in the middle where I'm providing enough information that a screen reader user is going to walk away from this bar chart with basically the same experience that I have as a sighted user. So when I look closely at this bar chart, I realize that there's 5 different variables on the y-axis. And for each of those variables, there's 4 different years being represented. So 4 times 5 is 20. So there's 20 data points that I could type in over here inside of the description field. And if you ask me, that's kind of like borderline. Am I going to type out all 20 of them? I could do it. It wouldn't be that bad. Depending on how fast you type, it might take you a minute or two to do that. However, I look closer at this bar chart and I realize that, like, hey, even as a sighted user, I'm not really sure what these numbers represent or these bars represent in terms of like the data. So, like this black bar for very satisfied, is that 52%? Is it 53%? Is it 52.8%? 0.562 3%. Like, I really don't know what that number is. The author has not given me like actual raw data here. All I'm seeing is like a bar, and how far across and where it intersects with the x-axis is kind of ambiguous. And that's going to be the same story for all of these. So if I'm looking at this as a sighted user, like, I don't want to sit here for a half an hour and get out a ruler and start measuring pixels between these bars and trying to figure out exactly what every one of these data points is and make sure that it all adds up to 100% for all 4 years. That's going to take me forever. And it might never even actually be accurate because I am just kind of guesstimating myself, even as a sighted user. So when I look at this bar chart and I just take a step back, like, what am I really gathering from this bar chart? I am seeing that over the years, 2019 to 2022, the vast majority of people were either very satisfied or somewhat satisfied with the IT environment on campus. Now, you might write that a little bit differently than I write it. You might analyze this a little bit differently than I do. But the point is that as a sighted user, I'm not really sitting here squinting at every one of these bars and trying to figure out exactly what percentage value each one of them represents. I am just consolidating what I see into a nice, concise sentence where it only takes me, I don't know, 10 seconds to type it out. And a screen reader user that ends up interacting with this alt text is going to have more or less the same experience that I have as a sighted user. They're going to walk away from this bar chart gaining just about the exact same information that I do by looking at it. So I'm not wasting their time by writing in a huge essay here trying to describe every little detail of this, where I'm kind of estimating for half of it anyway. And I'm not wasting my time, again, typing out all of that information. I'm just kind of drawing a line in the sand and saying, hey, this is a pretty good description of this bar chart. And if the author really insisted on me knowing exactly what these percentages were, they would have put all of this data into a table anyway. They wouldn't have just given me like this kind of ambiguous bar chart. Now, if you have a pie chart and that pie chart has 3 slices of the pie and every single slice has a percentage value associated with it, just type in the exact percentage values. But when you get into complicated bar charts and line graphs and scatter plots and that sort of thing, at some point you just have to be reasonable with your alt text and do your best to describe it and try to convert it into a couple of sentences that is going to explain what you're gathering from it as a sighted user. There really is no perfect way of going about this because, data visualization is ultimately going to be difficult for a blind person because they're not able to see all of the intersection points on these X and Y axis in all of the different labels. So you just have to be reasonable and kind of cut it down to a nice, couple of sentence long alt description. And with all of that said, now that we're done looking at the page and the alt description, you can see the HTML. It looks much more consistent with the PDF itself. We know that we've given a description to our chart. Our table looks nice and clean. We have a nice list. This is exactly what you'd be looking for. And then you'd be done with this page and you can export the document. So the purpose of this training video today, and thank you for watching and following along and sticking with it until this late into the video. Really appreciate it. The purpose of the training video today is just to get you started. Equidox has a lot of different bells and whistles, and PDF remediation is challenging because every PDF document is unique. What we do from one document to the next can change dramatically. So the purpose is not to turn you into an accessibility expert or an Equidox expert from this one training video. The whole point of this video is to get you started, to get you comfortable using the platform, navigating the interface, doing some of the basic things that you're going to encounter in day-to-day remediation. And as you use the platform, you might have unique documents and unique scenarios that we didn't cover in this video. We can always touch base and get back together and do more of a Q&A driven training. So the best way to learn Equidox, honestly, is to just get your hands on it and start practicing and playing with it and getting your feet wet. And again, we'll get back together and talk more in the future about your documents and your questions and make sure that you're getting the most out of the solution. So with that said, I just appreciate everyone for following along, and I hope that you found this training helpful to get you comfortable with Equidox. And we will chat again soon. Thank you very much. For more information about how Equidox Software Company can help you with PDF accessibility, email us at equidoxsales@equidox.co or give us a call at 216-529-3030 or visit our website at www.equidox.co.